Well, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eduardo Charles, and on behalf of the section for statistical programmers and analysts, we are delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, The Case for Statistical Leadership. We believe that leadership is one of the key skills to deliver greater value in our profession, and we are very pleased to have Dr. Gary Sullivan with us today to share his perspective and his knowledge on the topic. Dr. Sullivan holds a PhD from Iowa State University and is the founder of Espirer Consulting, where he has delivered leadership training to over 1,000 professionals within the pharmaceutical industry and the ASA, and has consulted with over a dozen pharmaceutical companies and CROs. Prior to this, he spent nearly 3 decades at Eli Lilly and Company, where he started as a project statistician and retired in 2017 as Senior Director for Non-Clinical Statistics. Before we hand it over to Dr. Sullivan, we want to let you know that you can ask all of your questions using the chat or the Q&A box, and we will have a moment at the end of the webinar to address them. And with that, let's all just welcome Dr. Gary Sullivan. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I want to start with an example, a bit of a story from my time as a statistician early in my career at Lilly. And in a sense, it's a failure of my own leadership. I didn't really realize it at the time, but it really set the table nicely for us to talk about what leadership is, why it's important to lead, and some of the skills required to lead. So I'm sure many of you work in the pharmaceutical industry, and even if you don't, I'll give some explanation of the example so that you can follow along, but the details aren't that important. So I'm sure that most of you that work in the industry support the clinical side of the business, and you all know that there are several phases that you go through in drug development, that there are studies run, and these studies, the purpose of these studies is to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of the drug product. And if it turns out after the phase 3 trials that the product is safe and efficacious, that there is a submission prepared and provided to the regulatory industries, the FDA or the EU regulatory industries, to get approval for that submission. So I worked my entire career on what's called the non-clinical side of the business, or what we call the non-clinical side. And at this time, I had a role supporting process development and manufacturing. And that side of the business is considered the CM&C side, the chemistry, manufacturing, and control side. And just as there is a submission from the clinical side, there is also a submission from the CM&C side. And in that submission, we have to show how we develop the processes to make the active ingredient, to make the final product, the analytical assays to characterize those products and those processes. And in my career, when I was working for bioprocess research and development, so this is the area that develops the processes for biologics. So these would be your insulins, your monoclonal antibodies, your injectables. And I had this idea, and the idea was, as part of the CM&C submission, you had to say, this is how we run our process, and here are the critical factors in each process, and these are the acceptable ranges within we can run the process. So, for example, in a situation where you had, this is just a hypothetical example, if you had 3 different process factors, pH, time, and temperature, you would say that your target setting is, for example, at 7.3 pH, and the acceptable range for pH is between 7.2 and 7.4. Now, in order to provide this information, the lead scientist would run usually simply ad hoc experiments that weren't very efficient, and a lot of times I didn't think really did a great job of demonstrating that the process truly was acceptable in those regions. So the idea I had was to use experimental design at that point to demonstrate the robustness of the process and to demonstrate that it can consistently run within those ranges. And that was important because when you provide these ranges, that says that if we run anywhere within inside these ranges, we produce the same product that was used in the clinical trials on the patients. And that's really critical. And my idea was to use statistical experimental design to use something called a screening design. So what you see on the screen is just a depiction of the design space that I have on the left here. And in such a design, instead of running lots of ad hoc experiments or all combinations here, that you would simply run the points that are circled. You could run the center point and you could run, this is what would be called a fractional factorial design. Many of you may have had training in this in graduate school. And I thought this would be a much more efficient way to run these experiments and demonstrate to support the data. And it would also give you better information. And so I took this idea to my senior director, who was my skip level supervisor. And I shared with him the idea. Now, this was not a statistician by training. This person was a biologist by training. And I explained to them my idea, and they asked some questions and seemed to understand it. And so I finished the conversation with them, and I left the meeting thinking like, okay, I did my job. I took this idea to my management, and now let's see if they want to do something with it. So I waited. Days went by, weeks went by, months. The idea just died. I never heard anything more of it, and I thought, well, maybe it just wasn't the right time, or maybe they really just didn't like the idea. Um, so basically, I asked myself later in my career when I started investing time in trying to understand leadership, and I realized that this really was a failure on my part. And when I thought about this many years later, I thought, why did that idea die? And there are several reasons. One was my inability to understand and communicate the value of the idea. Now, I thought it was, I guess, a cool statistical idea, and it kind of made sense, at least with my rudimentary understanding of what went into a submission, but I didn't really articulate the value to him in terms of the quality that it would bring to the submission, the number of questions that it would avoid from regulators, so the time that it would save our people from responding to questions. I also didn't really have a good idea of the big picture understanding. I didn't really understand how this would impact other functions. Okay, that it would impact regulatory, it would impact manufacturing, it would impact quality, and maybe even some people on the clinical side. In addition to that, I didn't have a trusted network of collaborators in those areas. So there was no one that I really knew or worked deeply with enough in regulatory who trusted me to be able to take this idea to them and convince them. Also, I really had no experience driving a change this big. And then finally, and maybe the most important thing that I learned that since it was my idea and my change, it was really my responsibility. And that's if you sort of ask the question like, what does this have to do with leadership? That's what it has to do with leadership. That it wasn't a failure of my senior director's leadership. It was a failure in my leadership. And at the time, I didn't really understand that. Now, I will come back to this later and I'll talk about what would I have done differently if I knew then what I know now. But I kind of want to start here in terms of just the idea of what leadership is. About 15, 16 years ago, I was asked by my vice president within statistics to help develop a leadership program for our statisticians, for our 300 plus statisticians at the time. And I pulled a team together, and the first thing I said was, we need to have a definition of leadership because I don't think there's a consistent fundamental understanding of what leadership means to statisticians. And so I kind of want to start there in terms of explaining to you what this isn't exactly that definition of leadership. It has evolved, but this is my current definition of leadership. Um, and leadership is the ability to consistently deliver value to an organization or cause by persuading others to act on or invest in your ideas. Okay. So there's a lot to that, and we will touch on a lot of these different things as I go through some additional examples. The important first point to take away here is, and it gets to that last point that I made on the previous slide, that it was my idea, so it was my responsibility to move it forward. It wasn't my manager's responsibility. And at the time, I thought that, well, the managers are the leaders. They're the ones that will identify ideas and create change. And that's the first, I think, takeaway from this talk is you don't have to be a manager to be a leader. And in fact, what I learned over my many years working in the industry is that it's really not the people in management that make the changes, that make the improvements, that introduce the breakthroughs. It is the technical leaders. It is the technical experts, the individual contributors. Okay, and this definition speaks to that. This has nothing to do, this definition applies, and managers can lead too, but also individual contributors, technical experts can lead. And that's what this definition speaks to. So again, I'll come back to this and sort of touch on the different aspects of this. But as I go through the talk, I'm going to share a couple other examples that were more successful, at least on my part, in terms of demonstrating leadership that maybe you can connect to. And then I'll tie those examples back to some of the concepts that are important and the skills that are important around leadership, why you should take on the investment of investing in your leadership skills, and also how you can lead and how to come up with different ideas. Okay. So this first example I want to discuss is an example in when I was working as a statistician. This is about probably a couple years after I had taken this idea forward to this senior director, and it has nothing to do with that, but just to give you kind of a time frame, about maybe 10 years into my career. And I would work with something called environmental monitoring data. Now, if you look at the picture on the left-hand side of the slide, this in some ways is an accurate description of how workers and operators have to dress when they're manufacturing biologics. Okay, it's a highly contained area. It is very susceptible to dirt and germs. And if there is any sort of contamination, any sort of mold, any sort of growth of any organism within that area, it basically shuts it down because you're dealing with living organisms and it can contaminate the products that you're producing. So environmental monitoring basically has to do with sampling these spaces. It would be sampling the air in these areas, sampling the surfaces, and then doing assays and growing the particles on agar plates to see if there is any bacteria. And there were what was called viable particles and non-viable particles. So viable particles are things that actually could grow into contamination. Non-viable particles were just dirt in a way, or dust floating around. And the more critical it was to keep the area contained and clean, the higher the level of cleanliness of monitoring you needed to have. So this data would be collected and it would be shared with me, and they would ask me to model the data and determine sort of limits, or just to tell them that, hey, your data is still well below the acceptable limit, even if you factor in variation. So the first step of this is understanding and modeling count data. And as you may know, there's many different types of count data, and there are many different ways to model it. You can use a Poisson type approach. You can use geometric distributions. You can even use normal distributions in some cases. And I used a number of all those to model different types of data because it would take on different types of distributions. And what I came to find is that because other statisticians supported other areas, that there were many statisticians handling similar types of data, and so we were using many different approaches. And at one point, I thought to myself, this seems to be an inefficient way to approach this, that maybe we can identify a single type of approach that was robust enough to handle all these types of data, and maybe we can then standardize and take a consistent approach here. That would save us a lot of time. It would save us a lot of energy, and I think it would project a nice type of picture to regulatory industries that we were working together on this, and we had developed a consistent approach. So I worked on looking at different approaches, and I actually won't get into the details, but came up with this sort of variation on a negative binomial distribution that seemed to handle all the data very well. And so I wrote a jump script to do this type of analysis, and I started using that for my data. Then I reached out to my colleagues in statistics. I showed it to them and basically got them to buy into it. So we were all using the same type of approach. And to make it consistent over a period of time, I decided that we should put it into a procedure. So we contacted the quality group, got them to buy into us writing a procedure, wrote the procedure, and then basically automated the process. So we had one robust approach, one script, one analysis approach for all the environmental monitoring data, whether it was in the clinical trial manufacturing area, the biologics area, the tablet and capsuling areas, any and all of those areas. So this notion of standardizing the approach and automating that analysis essentially saved us a lot of time. And you have to understand in the non-clinical areas of the business, there were only at the time there was like maybe a handful or 6 or 8 or 10 statisticians, and there are thousands and thousands of people working in manufacturing. So our time is very precious. So essentially, by freeing up our time, it created value. Okay. So this is one way to lead. Okay. It really fits in with the example of leadership, delivering value by getting others to buy into your ideas or invest in them and act on them. Okay. So I'm sure many of you have done maybe similar types of things. And this is an example of leadership. So many of you may already be leading in different ways. Now, another question I get when I do leadership training is this notion of, well, how do you come up with ideas? How do you come up with ideas where you can then demonstrate leadership, where you can deliver value to your organization? And I take people through this exercise because in our training, a lot of times we will have people come up with an idea and then encourage them to move that idea forward. And so I pose this simple question to people. And again, this is something that you probably do, but if you don't, it's something that you can start doing to think about ways where you can deliver value. Ask yourself the question, how can we do any of these number of things? How can we decrease cycle time or reduce cost? Okay. I'm sure you sit in meetings most every day or at least weekly and think about, gosh, we could do things much faster if we skipped this step or we automated this or we did things this way. How can we eliminate bottlenecks or non-value added work? The next example I'm going to give is around this. How can we improve productivity? I've done stuff along these lines as well. How can we deliver better products, services? How can we create efficiency? That's just what I did in the last example. So basically asking this question and answering this question is the seed for an idea, and it's the seed for being able to demonstrate leadership and deliver value. Okay. So let me go on to this next example, and then we'll sort of touch on, okay, why do you want to invest in leadership and what are some of the skills? So this gets to this notion of eliminating what I would call useless work, or maybe more gently non-value adding work. And I talked about in the first example how I didn't have a trusted network of collaborators. Well, this opportunity came to me in my first management role. So this was about halfway, little less than halfway through my career. I was managing the manufacturing statisticians. And I'd learned at that point in time that it was important, as not just as a manager, but even as a statistician, to go out and talk with your customers on a regular basis. And I would meet with a lot of the management in the areas that my statistician supported, a lot of the senior technical people, just to understand some of the challenges they were facing, understand some of the work our statisticians were doing, whether they were meeting their needs, whether there were opportunities for us. And one of the people that I met with he was the senior director in charge of the parenteral manufacturing plant. So he had responsibility for all the insulins that we would produce at our plant site in Indianapolis. And I got to know him pretty well. I'd been meeting with him, every few months for about a year and a half. And I had one of those meetings and I walked into his office, and before I could even say very much, seemed very frustrated. He said, "Deviations are killing us. They're just killing us." So I said, "Well, tell me more. What's going on?" And he explained to me that there was this huge backlog of deviations that the people in his tech service areas had to process. So if you don't know what a deviation is, simply put, it's any departure from a procedure that you have to follow in order to do your business operations or manufacturing operations. So in this case, in the manufacturing of products, the operators have to follow certain procedures. If they deviate from that procedure, for example, if they run the process outside the acceptable range, if they miss a step, that's a deviation. Every deviation has to be investigated, and the goal is to try to find a root cause to that deviation, and then put a countermeasure in place, or so it doesn't happen again. Okay. Well, the problem was that there were so many deviations that there was a backlog of deviations. And when the technical service people would go to investigate these deviations, they were investigating deviations that occurred maybe 4 or 6 weeks prior to that point of investigation. So they're talking to people that were involved in the deviation and asking them questions. And the responses were things like, well, that happened a month ago. I don't remember. Or, I've run the process a dozen times since then, and I can't remember the details on that specific date. And so the deviation investigations were basically coming back with a short document written up that ended with no assignable cause found. And so essentially it was just useless, non-value adding work. These tech service people were producing the same no reason found type of conclusion to every deviation. And the senior director shared this with me, and I asked him, like, well, where are the deviations coming from? And he said a lot of them were coming from the control charts that we were using to monitor the characteristics of the products that they were making. So when you make a product in manufacturing, you measure various chemical and physical characteristics of that product. So for a tablet, you're measuring potency and purity and impurities and hardness and disintegration time and all these different things. And we were control charting all of those measures, which is a good thing to do because it helps you monitor your process to make sure you're producing consistent product. Well, the problem was that when you have, in this case, there were probably 6 or 8 different variations of insulin that we were making, and maybe 8 or 10 different physical or chemical characteristics. So you're talking about getting close to 100 different control charts. And the technical service people weren't keeping up with the control charts. And when the control charts would go outside the limits, by definition, that triggered a deviation. Now, my first thought was that shouldn't be the case. We shouldn't be triggering deviations off of control charts. So I asked questions as to why we did it this way. And through a series of investigations, I came to find, after talking with some people in my group and talking with people in regulatory, that there was an FDA inspection 10 years prior to that. And one of the observations that the FDA made when they came in and inspected the plant, and this is well before the time that I worked there, basically they said, you have no way of identifying atypical results. So we weren't control charting at that time, and when results seemed atypical, like a result seemed a little bit high or too low, that we had no way of reacting to them and identifying them. And so for any observation the FDA makes, you have to have put a countermeasure in place. And our countermeasure was, well, how about if we control chart our the characteristics of the products? And so the FDA was okay with that. So in a sense, that was our commitment to them. From that point on, we would control chart things. And so my first thought was, well, if the control charts aren't adding value, why don't we just turn them all off? Well, I went to the quality people and the regulatory people, and they said, we can't do that because then we're violating our commitment to the agency that we made many years before. So in talking with some of the statisticians in my group and then talking with the regulatory people, I said, what if we turned off most of the control charts? How about if we just eliminated, like, maybe we just control chart the most critical characteristics like purity or potency. And after a lot of discussion, everyone agreed to that. So basically we shut down about 80% of the control charting. The tech service group was able to catch up and eliminate the backlog. And then this allowed them to start doing investigations on more meaningful deviations in real time, or it freed them up to actually do process improvements because there weren't as many deviations. So essentially, the value delivery here was basically by eliminating this non-value adding work and freeing up resources. Okay. The other lesson learned here was one, and this is, I think, a little bit helpful, is when you put something in place, when you put a change in place or you commit to doing something new, thinking about how are you going to sustain and maintain that change? And that's something I don't think was thought of when we made the commitment to the FDA. You have to be careful of what you're putting in place, and it just eventually created too much work for us. So again, another example in terms of delivering value by freeing up resources, eliminating non-value adding work, by identifying an opportunity through networking with some of your customers, and then having the idea of reducing the control charting and doing the work to understand how that can be done and getting people to buy into it. Okay, so that's another example of leadership. Anytime that you can eliminate non-value adding work, it delivers value to organization. In the previous slide, I had the dollar sign next to those different ideas, and essentially any idea that you can connect to saving money, like saving resources is saving money, reducing cycle time is saving money, eliminating work is saving money. That's an idea that's worth pursuing. And as a leader, anytime anyone brought that information to me, I was all for it. Okay. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is why invest in leadership. What's the point of me trying to be a leader? And I want to give you three reasons. And the first reason I'll sort of frame is this notion of, are you an owner or are you a tenant? Okay. So an owner is someone that has a personal stake in the business. They may actually own the business themselves or have a stake in that business. They have to worry about the upkeep of that business, the survival of that business, whether that business is making money and continuing to thrive. A tenant is someone who is just temporary. They're there for a short period of time and then they move on. And I like to use this analogy because it really does equate to the notion of ownership thinking is I'm invested in the business or the organization or the company that I work for. I have a long-term stake in that business or that organization. And as such, that it is my responsibility to make sure that business is thriving. So any way that we can increase our value, make money, eliminate waste is value to the business. Okay, so if you truly do want to have a stake in the business or the organization that you're working for, you should be thinking like an owner. That's ownership type of thinking. And I think you ask yourself that question. If the answer is yeah, I do want to have a stake in that business, then you owe it to that business to invest in your leadership so that you can deliver value in these ways. The second reason I would say is because you are uniquely skilled. As a programmer, you're trained to think a certain way. And that thinking goes beyond just programming, or if you're a statistician, just being a statistician. That you have a perspective that maybe no one else on your team has. And when you're thinking about like a cross-functional team, and whether it's scientists or physicians or developers or researchers, when you're faced with a problem, that problem is usually, if it's not a specific scientific type problem, it's usually an operational or business problem. And everyone's ideas are useful in solving that problem. And you should be using your skills in that way as well. Okay. You have a perspective, you have unique experiences that can be brought to bear to help solve that problem in ways that maybe no one else is thinking of. And the third reason I would lump under growth, advancement, and fulfillment. Anytime you have an idea and you're trying to lead and you're taking that idea forward, you're trying to drive change, that you're going to learn things. You're going to come up and be dealing with people you haven't dealt with before. You're going to be working with areas that you maybe don't have a deep knowledge in. So you're going to learn about those areas. You're going to learn about those people. You're going to have to learn to negotiate with people, to resolve conflict, to build relationships, to compromise. And all those things are good skills and they help you grow as a professional. From an advancement standpoint, I can tell you again from personal experience, as someone who was a manager and had people responsibilities, I was advancing and promoting and giving opportunities to the people that were demonstrating to me that they knew how to lead, the ones that knew how to take on problems, the ones that had ideas and were okay to drive change. Those were the people that I would promote. Those are the people that I would call on if there was an opportunity. And then the final reason is just for fulfillment. The example I gave previously about shutting down most of the control charting, when I had my next meeting with that senior director for the manufacturing plant, he was just unbelievably grateful. He was thanking me up and down and was telling me like how this is going to make things better for the people in that group. They're going to be more excited about working on process improvement problems. And just that sense of feeling that you've relieved somebody's pain is very gratifying. Okay. And as people, probably everybody on this call that went into this field probably because you wanted to help people, that's very fulfilling. And it really helps you stay motivated as an individual performer. So I would say those are the major reasons that you should invest in and statistical leadership, just leadership. Um, the next question I want to address, and I kind of touched on this a lot already, if you think about the different examples I talked about, what are the skills that you should develop or improve if you want to invest in leadership? And again, if you think about the definition and think about these examples, these would be the core skills that I would say you need to focus on. From a communication standpoint, just communicating your ideas, working with other people, being able to explain concepts, being able to connect them to business needs. A lot of it is about communication. I would say that, along with building trust, are the foundational elements of good leadership. Building trust in terms of getting people to know that you can be there for them. And the idea of building trust should happen before you need people, not when you need people. So this, in a sense, is an investment, going out and talking to people, getting to understand their area of the work, getting to understand their needs. That trust pays huge dividends when you do need to go to them and ask them for something or work with them. We tend to listen to people we trust. So if you can get someone to trust you when you're trying to lead and you want them to act on your idea or invest in your idea, it's much more easy if they already have some trust in you. The third thing here, this notion of business acumen, this gets to this notion of understanding the business. Okay, so understanding when you make any type of change, there's going to be other functions, other areas that it impacts. So having an understanding of the business, a good enough understanding, so that you know who is this going to affect, and that you have an understanding of how it's going to affect them, or having an understanding of the business to know that, hey, if I put this new idea, this new methodology in place, it will help this side of the business in this way. So being able to explain again how you're going to deliver value, not just from a standpoint of, this is a statistical type of advantage, but how it's going to help the business. Okay. Talked a little bit about negotiation and conflict resolution. Anytime you're working with people, you're going to have to negotiate ideas. No idea gets bought into in its first version. There's always someone that has some little caveat or maybe a piece of information that changes the idea. So being able to negotiate and resolve conflict with people is very helpful. This actually connects to the last one as well, the emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence is being able to understand and manage your own behaviors as well as the behaviors of other people, understanding how they're coming at a problem, how they're thinking, how they're feeling. So this notion of people relationships is very important in terms of leadership, and this really ties into trust, conflict resolution, and emotional intelligence. And then finally, driving change. Like, okay, if I have an idea, how do I take that idea forward? There is, I would say, a science and an art to that. And there are a lot of books written in terms of how that's done. There's a lot of examples that you can go to learn that skill as well. But the best way to learn it is to try it, is to take an idea forward and figure it out. So I want to kind of finish up by going back to that first example, that experimental design idea that I had, that essentially sort of fell flat and died, and sort of talk about what would I do differently, because this is an important part of leadership, is when you do have a failure or a setback, to take a step back and think, where did I go wrong? What would I have done differently? Okay. And the first thing I would have done differently here, instead of taking it to my management, would have been to talk to some of the development scientists, some of the scientists that I worked with in my area. And I would have pitched the idea to them to get their input on the idea, to see what they thought of it, whether they thought it was a good idea, it was a viable idea. And they may have even said, well, it's a good idea, but you need to think about this or that, or maybe you need to change this thing. And at any one of these points, I might have stopped pursuing the idea because they might have told me it's not going to work for whatever reason. But if I got it past them, then I would start to connect with other functions. Like I said, the idea was going to affect the regulatory group, the manufacturing group, the quality group, and maybe other groups as well. Um, and I might have even asked the development scientist, hey, do you know someone in regulatory that you've worked with that would be a good person to talk to about this idea? I might have even said, do you want to partner with me on the idea to the development scientist? Because maybe they had more credibility with the other functions than I did. And at that point, I wouldn't care about, who gets the credit or who takes the lead. It's just wanting to get the idea across the finish line. So I would have used them to point me in directions of other functions and maybe work with me to talk with those people. If that were successful, if we got it basically some idea from the other functions that they were supportive of the idea, then I would go to management, to my management and maybe even more senior management and talk to them about, we want to take this forward. And all you want to get from them in most cases is just the support that, yeah, I'll support you moving it forward. And typically, good managers, if they see a good idea, they'll say, run with it. Let me know what I can do to help. Okay. So they're not going to drive it, but they're going to be there to support you if you get their sponsorship, if you get their support up front. After that, I probably would have put a cross-functional team together, would have pulled in some of these development scientists, some of the people from different other functions. And again, it may not have been me leading the team. Maybe it would have been someone from a scientist from development and a scientist from manufacturing. And I would have just been there as the technical expert and one of the team members. And then at that point, I probably would have said, let's develop a pilot plan. So let's run a proof of concept. Let's pick a product that's early in development and let's apply these ideas to that and let's see how it works. And if that were successful, then I would go back probably to management, and talk about, okay, how do we apply this to future products? How do we make this part of our business process, our process of developing, transferring, and manufacturing products, and including this in our regulatory submissions. So that's what I would have done differently there. The last thing I want to talk about is, so how do you develop your leadership? So if you say, okay, Gary, I'm all in, what do I do? How do I get started? And I'll give you some high level things that you can do and then some specific things on the next slide. But the first thing, these are different sort of vehicles for learning. So I'm a big observational learner, and I would say that I learned a ton about leadership just by watching people in action. So if you want to learn to be a better communicator, study someone who's a good communicator. Study someone who does a good job of explaining concepts, of interacting in meetings, of listening, of speaking. Someone who presents very well. See what they do and copy it. Okay, whether it's something like that or someone running a team. If someone runs a team really well, study them and learn from them. And on the flip side, you'll learn as much from people that don't do things well, as much as you'll learn from people that do them well. So if someone is a terrible team leader, it gives you a lot of information in terms of, don't do this, don't do that, don't speak to people that way, don't withhold this type of information. A lot of learning can come through observation. The second way of learning is through reference. So simply reading books, reading articles, watching videos, TED Talks. There's a ton of information out there that is basically free. I'm not one to read books on leadership. I learned more by reading books on the skills that I talked about. So I've got a handful of communication books on my shelf. I've got books about how to build trust. I've got books about teamwork. I've got books about negotiation and conflict resolution. And simply by reading those books and seeing what experts say in terms of what are good practices, what are some good techniques, and putting those techniques into practice is a great way to develop your leadership. Obviously, through mentoring or training. If you want to be a good presenter, find someone who presents really well and use them as a coach or mentor. Go to them and help them work with you to be a better communicator, a better presenter. And along the same lines, training. I'll talk a little bit about a training opportunity that's coming up for you. But if you're fortunate enough to get training, it doesn't have to be necessarily leadership training, but if you're able to attend like a communication course or a course on teamwork, any of those types of trainings. I was fortunate enough to attend a leadership development course a little more than midway through my career that really turned the light bulb on for me and made me really passionate about leadership. Obviously, we learn from our experiences. So anything that you apply, and this connects to the last point here in terms of reflecting. So taking the time to think about, okay, I just applied these ideas to this presentation. Here's how it went. What did I learn? What could I do better? What do I not do next time? And you can do that for any type of experience, no matter what skill you're practicing. And this is something that should be a regular behavior, something that you do on a regular basis, because leaders think about leadership. So how would you move forward if you said, okay, I want to get better in communication? I would say, pick that skill, find a book, get a mentor, observe other people, start finding out and learning what you can about that, and then put it into practice, apply it, try it, see how it goes, reflect on it, adjust course if needed, do the things that work, don't do the things that aren't working, and continue to learn. And if you do that for one skill over the course of 6 months or a year, then move on to another skill. And in a short period of time, you start ticking off a lot of those skills and you'll get better and better in terms of leadership. So to kind of finish out here, just want to put some information up here. Again, the training opportunity, I'll be co-teaching a course at the Joint Statistical meetings in Boston on leadership development for statisticians, data scientists, and programmers. A one-day course. It'll be offered the Monday, and I thank the statistical section on programmers and analysts for sponsoring that course. My contact information is listed below. If you have any questions for me or want a recommendation of a book or just float an idea or have a question that comes up after the seminar today, feel free to reach out to me and you can connect with me on LinkedIn. And that's all I have to say at this point. So we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sullivan. I think this was an important reflection on ownership and taking things beyond our position and levels in organizations and more in trying to create value together with the company and with our teams. So we have a few questions listed here. First, Jonathan is asking, how do you recommend presenting ideas when leadership may be resistant to change? They're showing resistant.
Yeah. So one of the keys about creating change, there's two key things, and again, we talk about this in our course. The first thing is if you want to change someone's thinking, you need to meet them where they are. All right. So a lot of times when we go to make a change, if someone is doing something a certain way, we simply go to them and say, your way isn't good. It's not as good as this way. Okay, so when you go to someone and someone, for example, think about something you've been doing a certain way for years, no matter what it is, and someone comes to you and says, "You're doing it the wrong way." You have a defensive reaction to that, and essentially you're saying that that person is wrong, they're wasting their time. They could have all sorts of thoughts like they're saying I'm not smart, they're saying I wasted time, they're saying I wasted money, they're saying I'm not good, and there's a defensive reaction to that. The better way is to meet them where they are. So acknowledge, talk about what they're doing, demonstrate that you understand how they're doing it. You might even point out some of the advantages of how they do it, and then talk about maybe the um, the negative parts of what they're doing, that why it's not good. Okay. So in a sense, you start by supporting them to say, like, I can see why you're using this method. It's very helpful in terms of doing this. It's very efficient in terms of doing things this way. And they'll agree with you. And by agreeing with you, in a sense, you're building some trust with them. And then you can go, but I think we all have to admit that maybe when we're trying to do this, this isn't the best approach. Okay. So if you can build that sort of trust, either in the moment or beforehand, that's a good way to get people to, I think, be more open to change. And sometimes it might take several tries. Now, if you're going into a meeting and you know that one of the most influential voices in the meeting is opposed to what you're doing, I would talk with them individually first and see why they're opposed to it and what their position is. And again, this notion of meeting people where they are, so acknowledging that you understand how they're doing it and why the advantages of why they've done it and why it's been good, maybe, or also just investing in building trust. Okay, so before you even go to them with ideas, having a network of trusting people. The other thing you can do is to reach out to other people that maybe can influence that person. And if you can get them to trust you and buy into your idea, then maybe that person can influence the decision maker in a way. So there's a lot of different angles and approaches you can take that don't feel like, they don't buy in, so I have to give up. There's always ways to get to people, or sometimes it's just resilient going to people. I always tell people nobody ever bought into change the first time. There's always sort of an immediate reaction of no. And in a sense, if you expect that and prepare for it, that you're going to be better able to manage it. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and we have another question that connects with that you were just talking about trust. Bipin is asking, how does it work for a new employee? Because since success is usually so for getting a new idea to move forward, he asked, it requires trust, and trust takes time. So what tips do you suggest for new employees to gain the trust sooner rather than later?
Yeah, I mean, so trust is an investment. If there is an idea that you're trying to take forward and you maybe haven't built that trust with enough people, try to find a colleague that maybe does have that trust. Okay, so if you have an idea, and I've actually heard people sort of express this to me that they'll tell me stories like, I had this idea and I shared it with the team and nobody listened, and then 2 weeks later this other person had the same idea and everybody bought into it, and it's very frustrating. Well, the reason that they bought in is because they don't trust you yet. And that's not necessarily a knock on you. It's just that you haven't had time to invest in that trust. So be patient. Um, I always tell people in that type of situation, do the things that are asked of you. Okay, so if you're on a team, before coming with your ideas, find out what does the team need, and then support those tasks, help them solve their problems. Okay. Once you invest in what they're worried about, then they'll think twice about investing what you're worried about. Okay. So it's the trust takes time. So patience is one thing. But if you do want to move an idea forward, find someone that you know the decision maker does trust. And even like I said, it may be a fact of giving up your idea. Like I talked about, in that first example that if I went to the development scientists and they said, yeah, this is a good idea, and I felt like this person has way more credibility than me, and we're going to get a lot further if they become the spokesperson for this. So if I'm all invested in just getting the idea moved forward, I have to be humble enough to sort of say, I'm going to let you run with this. I'm going to let you take the lead on this. I'm going to let you be the primary voice and make the presentations and make the pitches. That's more important than me getting the credit. And over a period of time, as people develop trust in me, and then I can be that person for more junior people.
Amazing. And we have also another question that I think can like we can connect with this that we're discussing right now. Um, Katerina is mentioning that as a PhD student, they often take on additional projects to build leadership and other skills. So they're asking, how can I develop meaningful statistical leadership without overcommitting and risking burnout? And what differentiates someone who is seen as a statistical leader from someone who is a reliable contributor? And actually, Mani was weighing in on this and saying that your advice on picking one skill at a time can help on this specific situation. So, what do you think, Dr. Sullivan?
Yeah, so to the first part of the question, like it gets to this notion of there's only so much time in a day, and I don't for people depending on what your capacity is for work, if you feel like I'm already working 60 hours a week and this would just add on to that. And I do tell people that leadership is a sacrifice. I mean, if you want to invest in leadership, you do need to sacrifice. And sometimes it may just be carving out, 2 hours every week to, okay, I'm going to read a book on communication, or I'm going to spend that time on the internet sort of looking for people that are giving talks on strategy, if that's something you want to learn. So I would say that's the first part of it. You do have to make a sacrifice. When I was investing in my leadership, and this may sound sort of bad, but when I would go on vacation, I mean, I would take books about leadership and I would read them because I found it, first of all, I knew it was going to benefit me. I had a passion for it. And that maybe was sometimes some of the only time I could carve out like bunches of hours. So it may have to be something like that, that you may have to spend extra time. If you talk to people that have been very successful in terms of leadership, they're going to tell you that I had to sacrifice. I had to work a little longer some days or spend a little more time or do a little bit more. I don't know that there's any shortcuts. You do have to invest in that. And what was the second part to that? The question,
So,
Eduardo.
that's that. Yeah, sorry. The second part was what differentiates someone who is seen as a statistical leader from someone who is a reliable contributor?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the definition, okay, of delivering value by getting others to act on or invest in your ideas. So the example is it's kind of a difference between just being reactive and doing what you're told or being proactive and seeing, okay, I did what I was asked to do and here's the way I did it, and I think there's a better way to do it. So the next time I'm going to propose that we do it that way. And when someone says, okay, how do we make that change, that I'm prepared to then lead that change. Okay, so that's the difference I would see between those two camps, someone who's just being a consultant, someone who's more tending toward leadership, is the leaders or the people that were tending toward being leaders were people that were very proactive and they would bring their own ideas and they would push for their ideas, and sometimes they would even move them forward. And again, there is a science and art behind that, and that's part of developing and learning. But I would say that at least in a sort of high level in a short way is the difference for me.
Great. And we also had another question from Bipin that asks, how does a leader justify continued support from their seniors for someone who was a top performer but has not been doing well recently? And they also say that they live in a state that forces leaders to meet targets. So I think that's an important background
Okay,
on this
so
question.
read the first part again. So
How does a leader justify continued support from their seniors for someone who was a top performer but has not been doing well recently, like someone on their team? I think it goes a bit further to managers.
okay. And you said what about the targets again? The
They live in a state that forces leaders to meet targets.
okay.
That's like a background on the question.
Yeah, maybe I don't understand all this to it, but I guess I'd say one thing. I mean, leaders they have to hold their teams accountable. Okay. Now, the if
Dr. Sullivan, if I may, Pippin is saying on the chat that it's targets to find the lowest 5%. So
oh
I mean I think it's bottom performers, right? Yeah.
okay, all right, okay. Yeah, I think the first thing is to set that expectation with their employees, that the employees have to understand, and the people, the leaders in their group have to understand that there is a target in terms of, identifying the lowest 5%. And that's just a fact of life that people need to accept. I think the first part of it is helping people understand that expectation, because that shouldn't be a surprise to people. And then it's just a world that you have to live in. And if someone who was a leader is struggling, I think the fact that they did lead, and I would make the argument this way, find out like why it is that they're struggling. Okay, so if they have a history of being a strong performer and then they're struggling, in my mind, it's like there has to be a reason. I mean, the reason might be that maybe they were promoted to a level that they can't meet expectations at that level. So if that's the case, then maybe they should be taken out of that role. But there's often personal reasons that, maybe there's an issue with their family at home. Maybe they're going through a divorce. Maybe their child is sick. Maybe their parent is having to need care. And again, this gets back to building trust with your team so that you know these things are going on. And again, that may not be sufficient in terms of getting that person like a low rating or something like that, but at least it gives them time. That at least it says then to the team leaders, their management, to say like, this is why this person's struggling. Yes, their performance is not up to par. And if you talk to them and say that, I'm going to have to rate you lower this year, that they understand that, and we need to give them time. I mean, that's the best approach. I don't know that there's any solution for, you know, if there's got to be a lowest 5%. It's just a fact of life. I mean, personally, I don't like living in that space. I did have to live in that space for a while, because I think it creates a culture of fear, and a lot of people don't work well in a culture of fear. But it will separate, the men from the boys, the women from the girls, the top performers from the low performers. But I think the first step is making people aware that that's the culture they live in, and so they at least
Yeah.
knowing it helps to some degree. I don't know that there's a great answer for that though.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think we have any more seconds, but Money is asking about the books. What books are on your leadership shelf? Any books that you can recommend?
Which topic? Is there a specific topic?
Leadership, leadership.
I said I don't read books on leadership. I read books on skills. So I would recommend one book I would recommend is called The Power of Communication. It was written by Fred Garcia. It's a really good book on communication. Another book I would recommend is Patrick Lencioni's book, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. He writes books in sort of this parable form, and they're really easy to read. And if you're working in any team, that book I would say is I would highly recommend it, because it talks about the importance of trust, the importance of having open dialogue. It really does sort of spell out for you, how to run an effective, productive team. Another book on trust is called The Speed of Trust, written by Stephen Covey, Franklin Covey's son. Really good book on the importance of trust and how to build trust. I would say those are three maybe good ones to start with. And if you need others, like I said, feel free to email me. So
Great. So we want to thank Dr. Gary Sullivan for his time today and everyone for being here and participating on the webinar. Just a few things. Please complete the survey that you'll get right after the webinar. It's very short and it will help us bring you more content. Join us at JSM 2026 in Boston. Dr. Sullivan will be there with an amazing course for all of you. And also keep an eye out to our newsletter. I saw Christian is asking about the mentorship program. Keep an eye out for the newsletter. Anne-Marie sends it. And she sent one, I think, a few days ago, and it covers all the important topics of our section. Dr. Sullivan, thank you. Tessa and Julie,
thank
thank
you.
you for making it possible, and Bill. And yeah, we'll keep in touch. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye bye.